Without further ado, today's guest is Dr. Michael Flood. Michael is an internationally recognized researcher on men, masculinities, and violence prevention. He has made a significant contribution to scholarly and community understanding of men's and boys' involvement in preventing and reducing violence against women and building gender equality. He is also a trainer and community educator with a long involvement in pro-feminist advocacy and education. Thank you for joining us today, Michael.
Thank you. I just want to check that you can hear me all right.
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Thank goodness.
Okay, I guess I should stop sharing my screen now. There we go. So today's topic is one that I'm really excited to learn more about, which is apparently common considering the turnout today. In preparing for this lounge, I read a little bit of your writings and listened to a few of your talks, Michael. And a common theme that you have that I found really interesting is that we understand gender inequality in terms of female disadvantage. That's kind of the most common perception of it. But what you highlight is that we can flip that and look at the ways in which gender inequality is a symptom of male privilege. So where I'd like to start the conversation today is, although there are good men out there who don't bluntly assert dominance over women, how do men inadvertently maintain gender inequalities in their everyday lives, just as a symptom of male privilege?
Sure. Look, I think you've hit the nail on the head in pointing out that gender inequality is in many ways a problem of men, or at least of many men. It's a problem of the attitudes and the behaviours and the interactions that many men show. And I think, it's important for men like me to acknowledge that that is personal. It's not some abstract problem out there. So I can think of, times when, for example, I've, let my female partner do the, domestic work rather than take it up myself. Times when I've given more weight to contributions by men in a meeting than women. If I send in my CV with my male name, I'm more likely to be judged as competent, as hireable, as promotable than an identical CV with a female name. And so, gender inequality is in many ways a problem of men, a problem of the unfair privileges that many men gain. Having said that, it's not the case that, all men are doing fine and all men are living these kind of comfortable, privileged lives. And we know, of course, that men's lives are also shaped by ethnicity and race, by class, by sexuality, disability, and so on. So, the kind of basic feminist intersectionality 101 tells us that, of course, it's simply not true that all men are privileged, all women are disadvantaged. But so, I think for men in general, there's a sort of challenge of recognizing how we ourselves perpetuate gender inequalities and how we receive unfair privileges, whether we want to or not. No matter how nice a guy we might individually be, we still will receive some of those unfair forms of privilege just because of how we're judged in an unfair society.
Very well said. So with that idea of male privilege in mind, what is the role of men in achieving gender equality and ending the patriarchy?
Sure. So look, if we assume that gender inequality is in large part a problem of men, of men's attitudes, behaviours and relations, then really by definition, we've got to change those. There's a kind of compelling feminist rationale for engaging men in change. And indeed, feminism for a very long time has said, we want men to join us in tackling these kind of systemic problems of inequality. Remind me, what's the focus of your question though? Because I keep ranting on. Ali, remind me of your question.
What is the role of men in achieving gender equality?
Great. So look, men have an absolutely vital role to play. And I think there is a kind of widespread recognition in feminist circles and other circles these days that, part of the change is engaging men in change, and men will have a vital role to play. In terms of what men can do, the very first thing I think men need to do is actually look at ourselves, to put our own houses in order. And when, a man comes to me and says, I'm sort of concerned about this issue, or I've realized, I've heard there's this serious problem of men's domestic violence against women or workplace gender inequality, what can I do? The first thing I think that man can do is put his own house in order. So, and that means, for each of us men to look critically at our own lives and our own relations and think, am I treating the women and girls around me with respect and care? Am I doing that in the workplace, on the street, in the bedroom, in the kitchen, and so on. Second thing men can do, however, is to speak out, particularly in relation to other men. It's particularly important for men to challenge other men's sexism and other men's violent supportive comments. And ironically, men can actually be much more influential in doing that than women sometimes. So there's research evidence, for example, looking at male and female advocates for gender equality in workplaces. And when men speak up about gender equality, they're actually listened to more readily than women, whereas women are more readily dismissed and more readily seen as self-interested or as kind of anti-male and so on. Whereas men's kind of conventional authority and the fact that men are speaking out, in solidarity with women, in a sense, gives them more traction and they're listened to more readily, particularly by other men. Men, unfortunately, seem more willing to listen to men than to women. And, one response to that, therefore, is for men to use that platform to try to make change. Of course, it's also important for men sometimes to hand over the microphone, to amplify women's voices and kind of step aside and so on. So men have a vital role to play, put our own houses in order, speak out, in the men around us, among the men around us, our friends, our peers, our colleagues, and so on. And third, join in collective action, because really we're not going to make systemic social change without social movements, without collective social action. And the feminist movements over the last 4 or 5 decades have made a profound difference in all manner of domains of life. But men can join with women in social movements and basically in activism to become troublemakers, to start advocating for change.
We definitely need more troublemakers. And a quote that comes to mind, I can't remember where I read this, probably in one of the books I've been reading recently, but the quote says, "It takes more than one gender to have gender inequality and more than one gender to work towards justice." And men aren't often thought of when we use the word gender inequality or gender equality because of the reasons we talked about earlier. We typically think of it in terms of female disadvantage, but by excluding men in the conversation, it's going to be a lot more difficult. I don't want to use the word impossible, but a lot more difficult to achieve equality. So I'm so glad we're having this conversation today.
And look, I wouldn't say that really men have been excluded. I think there's been a sort of regular stream of invitations from feminist women and feminist groups for men to, be part of the solution and to take part in this. I think for many men, though, there's a sense that, sure, those issues are important, but what have they got to do with me? It's nothing to do with me. I'm one of the good guys. And even for men who feel like, no, there is an issue, men should do something, men often don't know what to do. We don't know how to speak up. We don't know how to take action. And of course, among many men, there's a real kind of sense of defensiveness, of blame, of, I'm being attacked, men are being shamed, not all men, those kinds of things. And while these responses may be understandable in some ways, ultimately they're unhelpful. They're a distraction from, the real work of starting to make change.
And in addition to that blame that you're mentioning, one thing that we've noticed in our work is that men sometimes feel like this isn't a place they belong, especially white men who often feel attacked when speaking of like male privilege and when talking about feminism in general. So it's awesome to have conversations like these to kind of break down those barriers and invite them into the conversation with open arms. So
Agree.
Michael, oh, sorry, carry on.
No, I very much agree. Yeah, that's all.
So in our discussion today, we're addressing 2 arguments that you often defend in your work, and that is men need feminism, which we've just talked us through, or sorry, feminism needs men, which you've just talked us through, and then the latter half of that is men need feminism. So my question is pertaining to that second half. Why? How does feminism and gender equality benefit men?
Sure. Look, there's been a growing recognition, in countries across the world that men's lives are limited in important ways by the patterns of gender we have, the gender roles, the gender stereotypes, the gender relations we have. I don't like the phrase toxic masculinity, but it's got a visibility these days. And, one aspect of the phrase toxic masculinity is the idea that traditional masculinity, stereotypical masculinity is toxic, is limiting for men themselves. And there's certainly a wealth of evidence that conforming to traditional masculinity is limiting for men. It limits our physical and emotional health, limits our relationships with women, sexual and intimate relationships with women, limits our friendships with men, indeed our sexual relationships with men, and limits our lives in all kinds of ways. And there's literally now hundreds of studies showing that men who conform more strongly to traditional masculinity tend to have shallower relationships, less involvement in fathering, greater vulnerability to depression, to suicide, and so on. Now, the reason that men should support efforts towards gender equality is above all because it's the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. Gender inequality, patriarchy is a systemic pattern of inequality that privileges many men and disadvantages many women. And because men are privileged by that, we have an ethical obligation to take part in change. That's the kind of key reason why men should support efforts to build gender equality. But a second reason is that it's in our interest to do so. It's very much in our personal interest to do so. And men will gain from progress towards gender equality. We'll gain firstly in terms of our own health, our own sense of self, and the kind of ways we can be in the world. If we can make progress towards gender equality, that kind of opens up the ways that you can be a man, the ways that you can be a person in the world. Second, we benefit in terms of our relationships. We will have richer, more trusting, more egalitarian, more sexually pleasurable relationships with women, deeper friendships, greater room to be involved in parenting and so on. And third, our communities benefit. If we make progress towards gender equality, then we have workplaces with a greater pool of talent. We have communities with lower levels of violence, including violence against men, which is overwhelmingly by other men, and a whole series of other ways that our communities and our societies benefit. So there's all kinds of ways that men will benefit from progress towards gender equality.
And now over the past few years, there is definitely areas in which we have made progress towards gender equality, but there are still areas in life where gender equality has not yet been met, such as violence against women, unpaid care and domestic work, and social protection systems like maternity leaves. So my question for you is, in your research, what efforts have you come across to engage men in finding solutions to these issues that are underway currently around the globe?
Sure. But one really interesting thing that's happened in the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 decades has been a turn to men in gender politics. One side of that is the growing discussions in media and elsewhere about, can men be feminists? What do we think about male feminists? And kind of, attention to high profile men who say even the most kind of, obvious and banal things about gender equality. But second, there have also been a growing number of campaigns aimed at the roles that men can play in building gender equality. UN campaigns like He for She, anti-violence campaigns like the White Ribbon campaign that encourages men to show their support for ending violence against women, and a whole series of other efforts. And they focus typically on, I think, 3 or 4 issues. The most well-developed area of work engaging men is engaging men in preventing domestic and sexual violence against women. There are local campaigns in cities and countries around the world. There are national and international campaigns. There are also efforts to engage men in sexual and reproductive health, sharing responsibility for contraception, sharing decisions about family size, being involved in domestic and caring work. And third, there are efforts on gender inequalities, particularly in the workplace. There are growing efforts to engage men in supporting efforts towards gender equality, mentoring women, challenging sexual harassment, and so on. And so there's now what you might call an engaging men field, a field of practice and programming, and also a field of scholarship. And because I'm, both an advocate and a researcher, I'm interested in what the research says. One encouraging thing the research says is that those efforts can make change, that well-designed programs can shift boys' and men's attitudes and behaviours and sort of encourage them towards more gender equitable, more respectful, more non-violent ways of being in the world. So that's really encouraging that that field is showing that it is possible to involve men in positive change.
Thank you for sharing those examples. Michael, your passion for this topic just really comes through. When I asked you that question, your eyes just lit up and you clearly really know what you're talking about and are so passionate about it. And it's really so great to see a man in particular so passionate about feminism and so knowledgeable on the subject. So just
and look, that certainly doesn't mean that I've got it all worked out at all. I wouldn't want to pretend to be some kind of perfect man. I absolutely, stuff up. sort of fall down in various ways. And I think that's part of the work, is acknowledging the kind of messiness of our personal histories and the ongoing challenge of trying to, live a good life.
Definitely. Very well said. So Michael, to leave our attendees today with kind of some actionable items, I'm wondering if you have any concrete examples or concrete actionable items, I should say, on how we as individuals or on the government like policy level as well, how can we engage men in the fight for gender equality?
Look, I certainly think that we need to build into our efforts, to address gender inequalities, attention to men. It doesn't mean that every single program, every single service needs to engage men. And certainly one issue as this engaging men field has developed is that some women and women's groups now feel pressure to include men in their work, or to make sure that part of their work is focused on boys or focused on men. And I think that's, that's unfortunate, because I think that women only and women led programs, funding and services are absolutely central still. And there's a kind of consensus in the engaging men field that this work should be done in collaboration with women and feminist organizations, and shouldn't compete for funding or kind of push women and women's voices out of the way. And that has sometimes happened in some places, unfortunately. But I think that, efforts to engage men have to be scaled up and built into, institutionalized in gender equality policies, whether that's national government policy or a local council's policy, or a sporting code's efforts to address respect and inclusion, or a school program on sexual harassment and so on. There's all kinds of ways in all those different settings at different levels where we can start to engage men and boys. And I think we have to do so with a clear sense of principle. And, I think there's three principles that are important. The first is to be feminist, or gender transformative is what it's often called in the field. That is, to be feminist, to pay attention to gender inequalities, and to be critical of sexism and violence and other forms of inequality, and to engage men and boys in critically challenging those. Second, I think we have to have some sense of a commitment to enhancing boys and men's lives, some sense that this will be good for boys and men to be engaged in this. And third, our work has to be intersectional. That is, it has to address the intersections of gender with other forms of social difference and social inequality, and recognise that men's and boys' lives, like women and girls' lives, are complex and diverse and so on. And so, for individual men, I think, look at ourselves, do the personal work of change, join efforts to build gender equality, educate ourselves, listen to women, read feminist books, respect women-only spaces, hold other men to account, and start to do the activist work. But for organisations and advocacy groups, then I think, to build streams of work engaging men and boys into your work, if that suits your agendas, and collaborate with other women's rights and feminist organisations in doing so. That's my, plan for, ending the patriarchy in 200 words or less, but, Yeah.
Amazing. I would now like to open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you have a question for Michael, feel free to either use the raise hand function, or you can also throw your question in the chat, and I will filter them from there. Questions or comments, I should say. Maybe, someone may want to say, you've really got this wrong, or I disagree strongly with that. That would be welcome as well. Of course. I see a hand raise over here. Michaela, go ahead.
Thanks, Allie. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been great listening to you speak. My partner's been listening as well, and we often debate different ways that we each express or show our feminist values. And one thing that we were both wondering is how to decide. Sorry about the noise.
We can still hear you.
Sorry, our dishwasher is being fixed right now, so the inside is really loud and outside is really loud. Anyway, it's a nightmare. But I was wondering how you decide when a good opportunity is for men to speak about feminism, when we talk about how sometimes men receive feminist thought better from men, or people in general may receive feminist thought better from men than from women. But we'll often get into arguments about, well, I have lived experience, so you should be listening to me, or, well, I have lived experience in a completely different way, and you should be listening to me. So are there different circumstances or different crowds or different subtopics that men often receive, or people often receive better from men than from women, or how to differentiate who has more power or control to share certain things that will leave a greater impact?
That's a great question, and the answer is not a simple one, unfortunately. And I think there's a number of different sort of, criteria or kind of questions to pose. One is, who's the audience and what kind of audience is it? So, for example, in the work I've done with very male-dominated corporate audiences, or in male-dominated team sports, the kind of Australian equivalent of American football, for example, then I've tended to think that male speakers, or male and female speakers together, because that can be a very powerful combination, are more likely to be effective than only female speakers. So, in a sense, the more sexist, the more patriarchal the setting, then in some ways, the more useful it is in some ways to have a male speaker. Having said that, not just any man, it's not that having a penis qualifies you to be an effective educator among male audiences. And obviously they need to know what they're talking about. They need to, have done that kind of personal work. There are, on the other hand, though, real advantages in having men like that listen to women, because there's research on how it is that some men come to a kind of passionate commitment to ending violence against women, or a passionate commitment to supporting gender equality. And one key factor for many of those men is hearing women's voices, hearing women's stories, particularly kind of being sensitized by hearing from a woman they know, a woman they care about, a wife, a daughter, a girlfriend, a mother, and so on. And so there are both advantages and disadvantages to both male and female speakers. And the kind of optimum combination may be, in fact, to have paired speakers, male and female speakers together. So I'd say it can be very powerful on the one hand for men to hear women's experience. Men often have no idea how much work women put into managing their everyday safety, for example, when they're going out at night or things like that. On the one hand. On the other hand, it can also be powerful for men to hear other men's critical reflections about masculinity, to hear other men kind of saying, here are the kind of good and the bad messages I got from my father, or I got from my male peers, or here are the ways I've been invited into the sexism, or here are the ways I've actually behaved in coercive or harassing ways, and I've now taken responsibility for and changed. So I wrote a book about some of this called Engaging Men and Boys in Violence Prevention, and I'm not trying to sell it to you. In fact, I give it away free via the website XY, which is a pro-feminist website I run. And in that book, I talk about the advantages and disadvantages of male and female educators. I also talk about the advantages of all male and mixed gender groups. And again, there are pros and cons to both. The website's called XY Online, and the book is available free. Don't tell my publisher that's not really what I meant to do, but the book is available free, in PDF at least, via that website.
Thank you so much. I'll definitely.
Great question.
Thanks.
I can see, Ali, I can see a question in chat, in fact.
For sure. I'll read it out just so everyone can hear. Kia ora, Michael. I hope I said that right. My name is Brody, and I'm the national coordinator for Thursdays in Black in... Oh, do you know how to say that, Michael?
Oh, I'm terrible at saying, but Aotearoa, I think you say.
Okay, it's in New Zealand, which is a student-led campaign against sexual violence for student in tertiary spaces. What do you think? So
that's university, what you'd call college in the North American context. Yeah, university context. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm just butchering this. I'm sorry, Brody.
Lots of translation. Yeah.
What do you think men specifically can do to be more involved and take on part of the work to achieving gender equality and take on sexual violence prevention?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to give you some context, in New Zealand, which is where Brody's coming from, and in my country, Australia, there's been relatively little attention to engaging men in sexual violence prevention on university campuses. And that's really different from, say, the US and I think to some extent Canada, where that's been an important part of this work, sexual violence prevention. There's organizations like Men Can Stop Rape and other campus-based efforts or college-based efforts engaging men and women in this kind of work. That's very underdeveloped in Australia and New Zealand. And one thing I'd say, whether in the university space or in the community space, mobilizing men is a critical strategy for change. And we know that, the one key reason why governments around the world have policies and programs on violence against women is the presence of an active feminist movement. That is the key influence on whether or not governments take up issues of violence against women, for example. And I think a key thing that we need to do is mobilize men as advocates. And that's not a simple process. It involves processes of recruitment, of education, of training, and then mobilizing in groups and networks. But I certainly think that's doable. And I think that's one key strategy that Brodie, in response to Brodie's question, we can use to engage men. And what that actually looks like may be slightly subtle. It may be that involves, for example, running workshops on campus on sex and relationships. So it's not how to make it less likely that you're raping the woman you're with, but that may actually be what it's about, that it's about consent, about respect and so on. But the kind of the carrot, the kind of thing that makes it attractive and young men may come along to, is something that's about sex, about relationships, about how to have healthy relationships and so on. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so I think there's two more in the chat, one hand raise. I'm going to address the first one that came in the chat, trying to go in order here. Amanda says, Michael, can you direct me to some resources on XY that I can share with the CEO in respect to recruitment of senior women?
Yeah, that's a good question. And what's been really interesting in the kind of corporate workplace setting is that much of the attention is to what women themselves can do to challenge systemic gender inequalities. The most kind of visible narrative out there is a very kind of individualist, neoliberal one where women should lean in. Women should lean in, women should speak up in meetings and so on. And, the clear problem with that is the kind of victim blaming that involves, and the reliance on individual women's efforts to make change, and the lack of attention to social and structural factors. And I think that we'll be much more likely to make change in workplace gender inequalities if we can get men on board. And the question was about, let's have a look. Where was it? There's lots of questions coming now. Goodness me. Yeah, senior women. I think that senior men can play a critical role. And there are some promising initiatives in Australia, for example. There's a program called Champions of Change, for example. And Champions of Change focuses on the roles that senior men who are in the boardrooms and top levels of organizations can play as champions or advocates for gender equality, whether that's through supporting gender equality initiatives and affirmative action processes, whether that's through mentoring, whether that's through trying to encourage a more respectful and gender equal culture and so on. So I can certainly direct you to those materials. Ali, one thing I'd be happy to do is share my email address. I don't know if you can make that available. If I can grab a moment, I can type it into the chat, because I'm very good at collecting resources and very happy to share them. We've got some other questions as well.
Michael, I'll throw your email in the chat while you're answering the next question.
Okay, I'll try not to multitask too much. I think I'll fall over.
Okay, perfect. So the next question was a hand raise. Ali Banks, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hello, my name's Ailey. I might put my video on and stop being camera shy. Hang on. Hello, my name's Ailey. I'm from Australia. I work for my local Women's Health Centre here in the Blue Mountains. And my role is I run like a youth activist group fighting gender discrimination and violence towards women. And we've opened that group up to basically anyone, which is great, but the majority of people that have taken up on taking action have been young women. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice on how we can engage young men to participate.
Sure. Ailey, that's a great question. And hello from someone else in Australia. Look, that's kind of, entirely predictable. That if there's a gender gap. There's a gender gap in awareness of gender issues, in awareness of violence and so on. And so women will come much more readily to these issues and to events and groups and so on than young men. That's kind of entirely predictable. But there are ways that we can bring young men into this. And one is, for example, to literally ask those young women or others to identify the men they know who are gender equitable, who regularly, routinely treat the women and girls around them with respect and care. That is to use informal networks to find the good guys, they don't have to be perfect guys at all, but to find the guys who, seem to have their hearts in the right place and seem to be behaving well. That's one strategy. Another strategy is a kind of tailored invitation where you have, say, a particular event that's focused on the positive role men can play, or focused on, I don't know, toxic masculinity, if you want to use that language or whatever. Some, events or streams of work that are explicitly focused on inviting men into that, and then recruit them to more ongoing involvements. So what have we got so far? Use personal networks, invite men in. A third strategy is go to where young men are. Go to the online spaces or the physical spaces where young men are, and again, recruit, and sort of invite them in. Yeah, there'd be some strategies off the top of my head.
Okay, I'll go to the next hand raise here. Tim, go ahead.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for your comments. I've got a question about how we can use policies to actually help shift attitudes. Because sometimes there are really great policies and even legislation that promote gender equity, but a lot of men don't even know about them, and I'm not sure to what extent being informed of them would actually help them.
Yeah, that's a good question. And, sometimes policy leads, sometimes policy catches up with broader social changes. But, policy by itself won't make change. And so I think, whether it's making policy on sex discrimination in the workplace, or on, local council policy on violence against women, or whatever the policy is, there's grassroots work to do of familiarising people with the policy, sort of diminishing their fears and resistance to that policy, which can often be an issue, and sort of building support. And that can mean building support both within and outside the settings where policy is made. Just when we're talking policy, there's been some really interesting initiatives in some countries in Africa and elsewhere to engage male political leaders as advocates for gender equality, because much of the work of engaging men around the world happens with men who are relatively powerless, university students or men in villages or other kind of, quote unquote ordinary men. And they may have some forms of power, but there's been a real neglect of our economic and political decision makers who are overwhelmingly men. But I think we need to redefine notions of leadership such that advocating for gender equality is seen as an integral element to leadership. I'm sort of segueing a bit from your point, Tim, but I think policy is a critical lever of change and can be an important way to engage men in change.
So the next question in the chat here is from Marco. Marco says, Michael, I was wondering if you could please share some of your thoughts around the correlation between feminism and non-binary equality.
Well, that's for me, that's a curly one, because there's really interesting debates going on at the moment over the kind of fundamentals of how we understand gender. And we're seeing a kind of an increasing complicating and blurring of gender boundaries. And there's many aspects of that, I think, that are incredibly productive. I'm really pleased to see in some ways a kind of blurring of the boundaries between masculine and feminine, or between men and women, and a sort of a growing acknowledgement of the complexity of people's gender identities and so on. At the same time, I do think there are some tensions between aspects of those shifts and some feminist agendas, and I think working those out is not going well. I think that there's a real, I think the public conversations, I'm involved in Twitter, and I think the public conversations on Twitter and other online and public spaces are not necessarily very productive or very respectful. But I do think that I'm not quite sure how to understand that question, but I think that feminist and queer and other progressive movements are promoting a kind of breaking down in some ways of gender categories and binaries. And I see that as productive. So one thing for men, for example, when we talk about engaging men, I think that part of what we need to do is encourage men, people who identify as men, to actually disinvest in gender, to care less whether they're perceived as real men or as properly masculine, because it's that kind of somewhat anxious and precarious investment in being seen as properly masculine that keeps some men from behaving in harmful or limiting ways.
Thanks, Michael. So I think we have time for one more question today. I'll go to the next one in the chat from Elliot. How do you think we can engage young men in change, especially for young men who engage with online anti-feminist groups that may be hard to reach?
That's a great question. There are sort of concrete, effective ways that we can engage men in change. And in Australia, for example, some of the most effective work is being done with boys and young men in schools. And in fact, in one of the 7 states or territories in Australia, respectful relationships education, focused on questions of gender and power and sexuality, is actually mandated at a state level. So every government-funded school now has to include curricula on that. Now that's not focused on boys and young men, but obviously it does involve boys and young men because they're half of every classroom typically. And that's one effective strategy for change. Another effective strategy is social marketing and communication campaigns, again, aimed at boys and young men and trying to kind of break down some of the codes of gender and sexuality that feed into sexism, that feed into sexual violence and so on. But online is particularly challenging. And there is, at the moment, there is a kind of an online sexist or misogynist, women-hating radicalization of some young men going on, where some young men are finding themselves in or gravitating in spaces where really they are learning a kind of bitter, deep, kind of women-hating hostility. And that's disastrous. And that is playing out in both online abuse and harassment of women and in offline, acts of violence against women. And so I think we need to intervene directly in those online spaces in a few ways. We need to divert young men from them by creating other attractive online spaces addressing issues like, how do you talk to girls? How do you pick up women? How do you, how should you be a good lover? The kinds of questions that some young men pose, but offering more appropriate responses to them than those forums provide. And we need to directly intervene in and challenge and shut down those spaces. So I think that, the kind of online space is a critical one for engagement and one we're just starting to think about.
Michael, I'd actually like to comment on what you say about integrating the, feminist approaches into school curriculum. It makes me think of, in Canada, we have the effects of smoking is like part of our school curriculum in grade 4. I remember we had these horrifying posters of the yellow teeth, the yellow fingernails. And I think that that's a huge reason why smoking cigarettes in Canada is like far less common than in other countries like European countries. So it makes me think about that, and starting young and educating these boys at a young age is a great place to start.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that also means parents can play a role too, particularly fathers, I think, can play a role in sort of shifting the kind of notions of gender and identity that their sons, their children in general, grow up with.
Of course. So I would actually like to take a moment to apologize to the attendees. I realize that the Eventbrite page says that the event goes till 6 p.m., but it actually only goes till 5:45 p.m. However, Michael has shared his email in the chat. So for those of you who didn't get your questions answered, please feel free to shoot him an email. And if you enjoyed today's lounge, we encourage you to dive deeper into Michael's work by checking out his website, which is also in the chat. You can find his book there and his other writings and talks. And yeah, stay tuned into our LinkedIn page and other social media channels for upcoming events. Notably, we're very excited to be hosting a book club series on what is considered to be a holy book here at DFN. It is called Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein. The registration link for that is now in the chat. So thank you all for coming. And Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Ali, a real pleasure. And look, it's really exciting to contribute to the network. And, I sort of look forward to going from strength to strength. And I've pasted into chat my email, my Twitter account, and a link to some of my writings in particular, just in case people want to chase those. But do feel most welcome to write to me. I'll very happily correspond with you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks, Ali.